welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about Venezuela today. It's been in the news a lot. And Jim, I know you've written some stuff. Austin, you've written some stuff on it that we've had up on strategy page. Jim, what's the current situation and what's the outlook?
Well, the current situation is nothing has changed. Guaido is still, the man in charge. He's getting more diplomatic support. He's getting financial support, which could be problematic because the corruption in Venezuela is epic, and it's not restricted to the villains. But I'm sure the United States and his other allies are all over him on that because that's all he needs is a corruption scandal. But a lot of assets are basically being entrusted to him. We're talking billions of dollars worth, and that's one thing that hurts Maduro. He's desperate for money. The Chinese have been very diplomatic. They've always been this way. They've last year when we reported. I do potential hotspot updates on Venezuela every few months. They were telling Maduro that they were a friend of Venezuela. They didn't make it personal. Maduro had no choice but to accept that because the Chinese have a team in there who are basically running about 10% of the state oil company's production and have doubled it within less than a year. But there's resistance within the oil company to letting the Chinese control more of it. This is basically as part of the deal to get their debts repaid by shipments of oil. Now, those shipments have stopped, essentially. There is some, how should I put it, breaking of this embargo. But this will become more and more difficult because the U.S. has gotten real good at cracking down on stuff like this. I mean, it's not the crackdowns are not airtight. But people are surprised, the level of expertise. We've been trained by Iranians, you might say, because they've become master smugglers. And it's a constant game of cat and mouse. But the United States now has an international network, plus the space satellites, a joint, a multi-group, multi-party group within the government. Where people automatically pull the information they have, especially on movement of products by sea or air, and so it's not something that is difficult to go after. And the Venezuelans are feeling the full weight of this now, which is probably a shock to some of them because it's not something that gets a lot of media attention, but it's been extremely effective in situations like Iran. Which likes to boast about, we're not worried about the reimposition of sanctions. But they are because it works. North Korea found out the same way. North Koreans, unfortunately, are possibly even more adept than the Venezuelans. But their smuggling is different than what is going on in Venezuela. Venezuela is talking about moving large quantities of oil. It's not just slipping in small shipments of weapons or even sending technical data, which can be delivered via, a flash drive or a memory chip. So the Venezuelans, Maduro is feeling the full weight of this. But now, of course, he can blame any shortages of food on Guaido, on the opposition, which is unfair because they're blocking the food that the new president, so to speak, the interim president, is buying and trying to have shipped in. And this is bad news because they try to inside Venezuela with the state-controlled press and Russian help. In fact, I went online to check some sources. And boy, the Russian trolls were out in force. I mean, it's not hard to spot if you're used to it. But they were all over the place, and apparently it's a high priority because the English speaking, the good English speakers working for the Russian troll factories systems are not abundant. There's only so many of them, but they basically deployed those. Russia is in worse shape than China because the Chinese actually have the resources to fix the state oil company. They also have more development contracts, more oil-related contracts than the Russians, simply because even the Venezuelans recognize that the Chinese are better equipped than Russia to actually do something about the state oil company. But it all comes down to the corruption. That's why in the update yesterday at Venezuela, I threw in the latest Transparency International, and it's a sad story. I mean, Venezuela was pretty corrupt, when Chavez, was elected. Was it 99? I mean, it wasn't as nearly as bad as now, but it got progressively worse. So that when Chavez died, it was like the score was 23 on the 1-100 scale. Now it's down to 14 or something like that. It's under 15. They're in the top 5 most corrupt nations in the world. They've been that way for several years, and that's going to be a major problem that any new government that's in full control has to deal with, because you've got the bureaucracy is totally saturated with these pro-Maduro patronage appointments. And that's what's basically killed the oil company. Now, they're also going to have a problem in getting back a lot of the key oil company executives they had until about 10 years ago. Chavez started the house cleaning when he was getting pushback from the oil company about things they were being asked to do, which were basically, impossible, ineffective, or, simply a bad idea. Nobody asks those questions anymore, but the oil production has been sinking now precipitously for the last few years, and that stuff doesn't get fixed overnight. But at least you can get foreign aid in. Maduro had never accepted foreign aid. He said, "We don't need it. We're not in trouble," which was ridiculous because even with the media crackdown, God bless the cell phones and cell phone photos. Even if they shut down cell phone service, you can still take those pictures and pass them on, memory chip to, or just transfer to somebody else's phone, and who's getting out, and say, "Here, turn these over to a first journalist you see on the other side." And so the stuff gets out anyway. That's the biggest liability, vulnerability that Maduro faces right now. He cannot hide what's going on inside Venezuela, and that's hopefully what will eventually bring him down.
Hey, let me make a point about that. There's some leakage because of cell phone service on the borders, not just with Colombia. There are some places supposedly close to some of the offshore islands where people have.
Curacao is apparently taking the lead. Yeah. That's Dutch.
And that's, I think that I get that anecdotally in reading, but it's easy enough for somebody, as Jim said, just to pass it on. But there are enough sources in there now. Have been American diplomats. There are all kinds of places that the evidence can be transmitted, through which the evidence can be transmitted to the rest of the world. Look, I wish the Chinese were as savvy in the South China Sea as they are with they're playing this diplomatically in Venezuela. That was the biggest hit Maduro's taken since the National Assembly made Guido really the interim acting president and declared Maduro illegitimate. That was huge. And look at the reaction by a majority, not a plurality, a majority of the Venezuelan people. The whole regime, the Chavista regime of Chavez and now deceased, and Maduro is crooked. They hate it. They've impoverished the country, and they're dictators and thugs. So the National Assembly acted. U.S. recognition, not just U.S. recognition. Take a look at the lineup in South and Central America and internationally. Now, Russia and Iran, of course not. China, well, was kind of sort of with, Russia and Iran supporting Maduro, but that's why I say that's a big deal. The Chinese have money, technical expertise, and they're talking to the National Assembly. It's kind of tough to call them the opposition. They're opposed to Maduro, but they are a much more legitimate government in the eyes of a majority of the Venezuelan people, and now internationally, in terms of what's being recognized, the Maduro's government. And as Jim pointed out, another nice twist to this, it's being led by the United States, but then the Great Britain's on board with this. All the other financial powers, I would be surprised if we hadn't lined up Singapore and put some pressure on UAE and other banking centers to do business, if there is business to be done, with the National Assembly and cut Maduro off. And as Jim said, that he needs money to keep his thugs in line, keep them paid, keep what remnant regime he's got afloat, provide food and ammunition for his security forces. Again, before I make it sound like he's just about to wilt and fold, he may be, but he's got Cuban security agents around him. He's got Russian so-called mercenary security agents. Probably got Russian intelligence officers as well, and he's got his own internal security personnel, and they're some of them are personal security personnel, but he's got at least, I think the general figure out there is 20,000 hardcore loyalists. Now, what does that mean? It means that he has not gone gently into the good night, which it would be so much easier if he would just pull up roots, whatever he's managed to steal, he runs. The thing is, though, as Jim pointed out, not only do we have these multi-agency capacities for looking at catching smugglers and the like. We've got multi-agency and multinational fusion cells for tracking down financial crimes and also financial trails. So if Maduro ran, there's a possibility that some of his billions might get recovered. I'll use an example here. That's what's going on in Angola right now with a new Angolan government. They're trying to track down $2 billion that I believe it's the son of the former president pilfered from one national fund. Is there still a possibility that bullets are going to fly? Well, I just said that Maduro's got loyalists. Has the Venezuelan army defected to the National Assembly? Well, we keep hearing mutterings. We know that a number of defense attaches and then a senior Air Force general, and then there was last week, about 10 days ago, a colonel who was best I could make out on the article, had been a commander of a brigade. I don't think he was a current commander, had said that 80% of the military services were opposed to Maduro and wanted to take the country back from the Chavistas. Now, it's just one opinion. There was no name on it. It was an attribution of his rank and something that he had done. Could it be propaganda from the National Assembly? Could be. I think it's actually symptomatic of what's going on in the country, and there are military units that are looking for the opportunity to support what is now the internationally, for the most part, legitimate government. Still a mess, though, Dan, a huge mess, and I'm not going to put a time frame on how long this is going to go. I just know that the drying up the money, as Jim described, is like cutting off Maduro's blood.
Yeah, Jim, the Russians have been making some flights in to the area. The Chinese have brought some naval ships in at different times, but it doesn't seem like either of those are really going to back him up, right?
No, and the problem is that nobody wants to pull the trigger, literally, the first. Even the secret police or the national intelligence, whatever they call themselves, they arrested Guido briefly, and then he was ordered released because apparently someone realized this is the last thing you want, to try and imprison him, because the National Assembly is basically a national legislature, so to speak. The last free election in 2015. After that, Maduro realized he cannot have any more free elections. And that was the point where he realized he had lost his majority, which Chavez had held, through all sorts of economic problems and disasters. But Maduro was not the guy. He was not as smooth an article as Chavez was, and he was basically more corrupt. Speaking of the corruption, they're already cracking down in the United States. Apparently, the United States had its eyes on the money laundering efforts by the corrupt Maduro officials, and they're basically putting, how should I put it, freezing billions of dollars worth of real estate assets, and then demanding, proof of their provenance, of who actually owns them. Again, that's something the United States has gotten pretty good at, as has Britain, because that's the primary buyers for the high-end real estate. And a lot of these new apartment buildings, luxury apartment buildings in New York, for example, one newspaper went in and just did a little digging around and found out that on average, half of them were empty apartments. Now, some of them were people who just had second or third or fourth homes and just simply came through a couple times a year, and that was it. But by doing a little, how should I put it, skullduggery with the staff at them, anonymous tips, as it were, they found out that, a lot of them had never been occupied. And they're held by some, cutout, corporation doing business as it says. I mean, you can basically build up a multi-level, cutouts, shells, organizations that get increasingly difficult to find out who actually owns it for any number of reasons. But one of the main reasons, in many cases, with these high-end investments, is to hide illegal money being laundered. So a lot of that, once you get all your legal, how should I put it, details and lined up properly, you can basically seize those. That worked very effectively against Iran, and that would make the news periodically over the last decade, where how should I put it? In one case, some commercial buildings were owned by Iranians during the revolution, and were seized by the current theocracy, and they were basically declared fair bait for people who had won lawsuits against the state of Iran for terrorism and what have you. And these were literally seized. So you can't do it. It doesn't happen quickly, but once the legal process starts, they can no longer sell or even use a lot of those assets. So, and that I was surprised at how quickly that kicked in, because apparently they've been lining their ducks up legally on these properties for a long time. And allegedly, the corruption in Venezuela was worse than a lot of people thought. It may be, that, for example, the majority of the oil money was basically disappearing, oil income. And this is not unusual, because there are many ways you can steal that income. It's not just taking the money coming in from the oil company or from the offshore buyer who wires you so many $100 million. You can basically steal a lot of money with the currency transfer laws. You basically get to buy dollars very cheap, while the black market is charging you a lot more for those dollars in the local currency. That's one reason why you have the hyperinflation in Venezuela. The bolivar, the local currency, is basically worthless. And when they try and translate what people are being paid people who have jobs in Venezuela, it comes out to like $12 a month or something like that, and there's no food to buy. It's like old Soviet Russia. As Margaret Thatcher said, or whatever. The socialism is great until you run out of other people's money, and that's happened. Another advantage Maduro has, he has a lot of allies. The papacy, for example, is reluctant and often refuses to criticize people like him or like Putin in Ukraine or Assad in Syria, which is surprising. But you've got a South American, Pope who has a history of having a fondness for radical politics. In the United States, you have a lot of support. In fact, one of the things Iran has going for it now, in terms of its support for Maduro, is that he's got a lot of support in the United States to basically cut off arms support for Saudi Arabia. I don't know about the UAE, but now this is ridiculous. I mean, they're actually they passed it in the House, and they're trying to pass it the cutoff in the Senate. Trump says, he basically, I'm not going to sign. I'm not going to veto this. This is not going to get signed because basically it places into the hands of the Iranians as well as Maduro. Because the Saudis, if they can't buy weapons from the United States, who has been their major supplier for decades, well, the Chinese are already making inroads. When we wouldn't sell the Saudis, Predators, armed with missiles, the Chinese basically showed up, and they've basically sewn up the market in the Middle East. They've sold hundreds of Predator and larger size UAVs with Chinese designed, versions of the Hellfire, laser guided missiles. That technology is not high tech anymore, and their stuff works pretty well. The Iraqis bought a bunch of it, and they basically were quite effective in the battle for Mosul, and still are. So the Chinese are waiting to take all of our, all that business away from us, and basically puts the Saudis in a difficult spot because they're trying to, obtain more allies against Iran. And here it is, the United States, Congress is basically voting to cut them off.
Jim, the reason on that is the Khashoggi murder. That's the least. That's the reasons given.
I know, but the Khashoggi murder is BS. Basically, he was considered an Iranian shill. Who got the job with the Washington Post of contributing a column simply because he would say what the Post wanted, and they just wanted somebody from one of America's most important allies to basically say nasty things on command about the Saudis. That's not difficult to do, but the fact of the matter is the Saudis have been loosening up the last few years. They've been trying to reform for over a decade. They made some very fit. We reported it, but you got partisan politics in the United States now. It's not enough for the Saudis to try. They basically have to roll over and say how much do you want us to squeal, and they're simply not going to do that. That's basically a matter of internal politics in Saudi Arabia. The new crown prince, who apparently was not very amused at Khashoggi being killed, apparently by some of his own intel people. But he's got to handle it very carefully because a lot of Saudis saw Khashoggi as a traitor. You got to pay attention to domestic politics. But in the United States, anything that makes the current president look bad is good, no matter who it is. They deal with the devil, as it were. And right now, the devil's having a fire sale, so to speak, because there are all sorts of factions out there, be it Cuba, Russia, Iran, China, who are asking for a little legislative help, political help from the Congress, and they got a lot of people willing to provide it. So, that's just something that is not unique to the United States. But, we like to think we're above that sort of thing, which we've never been, and especially now. That's why it was important when Austin pointed out that the support for Guido's, basically invoking the law. See, Guido had the law on his side. He's an engineer, but they got a lot of lawyers got elected to that last, that last free election to the National Council, and they basically have been going after Maduro, and Maduro's been trying to keep it technically legal. He basically stuffed the Supreme Court with partisans, people he knew he could order around, and he got a lot of things changed. But he was not able to invalidate the National Assembly that Guido was elected president of by the Assembly in December, and he took office on the 5th, 5 days before Maduro was to get sworn in president, because of an election which was recognized by his neighbors. Usually Latin Americans stick together in things like this, but the election was so biased. And of course, what's really annoying the neighbors is all the refugees they have to deal with. Not only that, but the gangs, the crime that is spilling over across their borders. The Colombians are somewhat used to it because they've been dealing with it for a long time. But Brazil is not amused, and nor are most other Latin American countries. And this is a problem that Maduro has brought on himself, and it's out of control. See, that's the problem with it. So the problem is no longer a decision that the Venezuelan government can make to halt a cross-border problem. You need a new government because it's basically now endemic in Venezuela that the people are not being fed. The economy doesn't exist anymore. The GDP late last year fell below half of what it was 5 years ago, and that's incredible. A precipitous fall like that. And not only is the GDP declined, but it's even more precipitous if you look at the value of imports, because most of the money that is still there is being stolen. The imports are down 80% from 5 years ago. That is how much the economy has declined inside Venezuela. So it's not just all GDP. GDP just means how much money is being generated in there, not how much is being used for the will of the people, for the good of the people. And now the amount of poverty and extreme poverty is much higher than what it was, when Chavez was getting elected 20 years ago. And that is the real thing that is making Maduro unwelcome in his own country, because the people who for years supported Chavistas, the Chavista idea of a Bolivarian socialist republic, have turned against it. And the only ones who are not are basically gang thugs. I mean, literally talking criminal gangs. And these are the ones that Maduro really has to worry about, because he can order with some effectiveness the military to not shoot. And there seems to be a feeling among the rank and file that we're not going to fire on our own people. But for the gangs, they're basically they're gone wild. They're stealing, they're plundering. That's another reason why food isn't getting to the people, because not only does the army steal it, they are officially since over a year now controlling the food distribution system. But the gangs will come in and just outright steal it. They're breaking whatever laws still, exist, as it were, in Venezuela. But Maduro tolerates them because they will, in a pinch, support him. But it's the kind of support you don't need. And if the gangs lose it and start firing on the Guido followers, the majority of Venezuelans, then you've got a really tricky situation. Nobody wants to intervene. But what happens? This is what got us involved in Libya. Look how that worked out. Back in 2011. When you start getting mass murder within a country, or democide, as they say, what do you do? And it's a little trickier in Latin America, because we have the Monroe Doctrine, which still applies. I mean, some administrations will apply more severely than others. But, even when Obama was in charge, the Monroe Doctrine was still basically taken for granted by the South American countries. And what the Monroe Doctrine means, for those who fell asleep during that class, is that foreign powers cannot use force to collect debts in the in the Western Hemisphere. The United States will not allow it. uh, and gunboat diplomacy. And that's something that the a lot of Americans like to complain about the United States, but they don't really want that changed because that's basically proven very useful because there's a lot of national bankruptcies in South America. It's a regular thing, and at least they don't have to worry about some foreign predator sending in the troops. So the Chinese are well aware of that. The Russians are aware but don't care. And that's why our Middle Eastern allies are so important, because the UAE bank, or the UAE itself, was involved in an effort to get 20 tons of the state gold reserves in Venezuela moved offshore and basically disappear. Apparently, Russia airplanes were coming in there, but Russia is under sanctions, so they have to use a cutout, an intermediary. And the UAE has always been infamous, for providing all sorts of services like that. And apparently, we still have enough clout with the UAE to say, don't do it. And it held. But Britain already stood up and said, no, we got that. They have $1.2 billion worth of gold. And Maduro said, hey, we want to move that gold. And Britain said, whose gold? Not your gold. It belongs to Guaido. And that's that. So, as everybody understands, it's all about the money, and basically, a lot of the money is flowing, if not to the National Assembly, it's being basically blocked, by the sanctions, and that is ultimately what's going to bring Maduro down. But the problem, even with the money, people weren't getting fed. Basically famously leftist, NGOs, aid organizations are saying there's a real problem in Venezuela. The government, Maduro, is not letting food get to the people. He's doing nothing. His basically party line is there's no hunger in Venezuela. So there you go. But what's the truth? It's not going to get you fed.
Joe,
somebody has to do something.
One of the things that Chavez even allegedly did a little of this, but Maduro has used food as a weapon, as a political weapon.
Yes,
and that's even before the collapse. The collapse began, and you go back and read some. Not necessarily on strategy page. I want to say 7 or 8 years ago. Check out some wire service reports, as I recall, on Venezuela, saying that one of the things that the Chavista regime was up to was encouraging some of its opposition inside Venezuela to leave, go. And whether I'm not connecting that one-on-one with the denying food or services and the like, that did become a policy against denying food to regime opponents. But go ahead and leave.
That's something the Cubans would have advised, because they basically realized more than once, not just the first time around, but then they had the one in the 80s.
And then they had another one in 94, 95. I mean, another migrant reform. And so
you have educated people who could literally replace the government, let them out.
That's right.
But people like Guido and a lot of others stayed behind, even though they had trouble living, supporting their families and what have you. They realized, they knew what happened in Cuba, and they realized if any sort of representative and fair, non-corrupt government was going to survive in Venezuela, it had to be people like them to basically stay behind, take the heat, and do what they're doing.
Jim, these people are courageous. I've written that. You have too.
Yes.
These people are courageous, and they've done it the right way. I was just mentioning that 7, 8 years ago because I was thinking, are we going to see something kind of an echo of some of the things that Castro pulled with those migrant waves? Well, we didn't. We have now, but not for the not for the same take the pressure off reason. It's because everything's collapsed in socialist Venezuela, with the exception of Maduro maintaining enough guns to keep himself out of prison or away from exile. Dan, as we wrap this up, Jim went back and brought up the UAE again. Remember, I mentioned them as putting pressure on them and their banks. I'm guessing, Jim, that we've done that successfully. Is that what you were
yes,
saying?
yes.
I think we've been successful in cutting off Abu Dhabi and the like from helping Maduro move those assets. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and the UAE basically has a non-corruption, a clean government score equal to Israel. In other words, they have a lot of entities within the UAE. They were always doing that. The coastal cities where anything could be arranged, as it were. But the UAE basically cleaned up the rack better than anybody else.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware of that.
And they depend too much now on legitimate banking activities.
Yeah, well, they certainly have, really, for the last decade. If you remember, though, back in 2005, 2006, that huge banking scandal.
Yes.
Involved in that money laundering and losing money. Dan, one other thing on how much has been stolen. Jim talked about missing billions. It's jaw dropping, but it's probable. For example, last fall, there was suddenly turned up a $200 million shortfall between oil shipments and money going in the bank. I haven't seen. I said last fall. Actually, it was probably last summer. I haven't seen any follow-up on that particular story. But if you watch this over the decline of the last 3 or 4 years, you can come up and seeing $5-6 billion being stolen. And it's not just oil money, even though oil might be the one of the best gauges you have on looking of theft by the Maduro government. It's an absolute tragedy, and as Jim said, also the refugee waves. That's an economic assault, really, on Colombia and other countries in the region, because somebody's got to take care of them. Somebody's got to help them. And if there is violence, and this is, I've actually got a couple of columns I've done on this. If there is violence in Venezuela, there will be pressure to intervene in some fashion. I would like to see, even though this is so dangerous on this, given the politics in South America, I'd like to see a South American / UN force take it, and not just the United States. Not the United States, other than just providing logistic support and maybe intelligence support. If that,
that's worked pretty well in Africa. The African Union.
It has. I think you're seeing the model on that.
And I think I think the United States, well, the Western countries in general, they're very reluctant to get involved in these international peacekeeping operations anymore. They will provide, once it's established, they will provide specialist services. They usually there's a shortage of helicopter or air support, technical, but they don't want to be the guys with the guns. And that's what you're asking for. Let the Latin Americans supply the boots on the ground. We can basically supply, air transport, intelligence, whatever. Logistics, but it's the people, holding the guns on the ground who get all the headlines.
I don't want it to come to that, Dan, and I don't want get email saying that there's Austin Bay advocating another operation. No, I'm looking at it as something that if you went to the case where the gangs are shooting people in the streets, and we're seeing thousands of dead. And put a number on it. I don't want to go into that moral. But the thing is, there's going to be a push.
Yeah, the theft toll hasn't been that high so far, and that's something Maduro is apparently has to deal with That's a big red line that he does not want to cross. But what, as we're seeing what happened now, like 20 years ago in the Balkans, when when you had all the massacres and what have you, the Europeans looked at us, and we basically looked back and said, "Hey, it's your problem." And that's when they, despite the fact that many of those West European countries didn't want to get involved in peacekeeping, we basically told them bluntly, "Look, it's your backyard." And what really convinced the West Europeans and our NATO allies to man up, as it were, and do what they wanted done was the fact that they were getting all these refugees. That's what they were really hacked off about. They people talk all about social justice, et cetera, but it comes down to the pocketbook.
Well, there were at least, the 200,000 figure. There's debate about that, and that killed in Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and that the thing is, I think that's a pretty good number based on the forensics. That's a lot of dead people.
But that wasn't bothering the Europeans as much as the millions of refugees.
I get it. Hey, Dan, I think
we've got to wrap this up. Okay. It's been a good discussion, and something's going to happen down there, and probably sooner than later.
It's already happening. It's just You don't want it to go what we were just talking about.
Right. All right. We'll talk to you guys next time.
Bye, guys.
Take care.